It was a crisp evening in the heart of Baltimore, the kind of day where the air feels dense with stories waiting to be told. The 5:15 bus was packed, as always, carrying a mix of weary workers, chatty students, and quiet souls eager to reach their destinations. Among them was an elderly black man, seated near the front, his presence as unassuming as the faded jacket he wore. He clutched a cane, its surface polished from years of use, and gazed out the window as the city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows. He seemed like just another passenger, a fleeting face in the daily grind. His lined face carried a calmness that spoke of patience and endurance, the kind of calm that comes from someone who had long made peace with life's chaos. But there was something else too, a certain weight in his posture, as if his frail body carried a history far greater than anyone could guess. The bus hummed along its route, its passengers lost in their own worlds. Conversations buzzed in low murmurs, punctuated by the occasional jolt as the brakes squeaked against the steady rumble of wheels. Near the back, a group of teenagers had just climbed aboard, their energy loud and restless. They moved in that careless, swaggering way, cracking jokes and laughing with a confidence that teetered on arrogance. One of them, a lanky boy in a bright red hoodie, stood out. His voice carried above the others, sharp with the kind of mischief that sought an easy target. His eyes scanned the bus, searching for something, or someone, to amuse his group. When his gaze settled on the old man, a slow, smug grin spread across his face. "Yo, check it out," Red Hoodie muttered to his friends, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Gramps, looks like he got lost on his way to the retirement home." His voice dripped with mockery, drawing a ripple of snickers from his crew. The elderly man didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the world outside, his grip tightening imperceptibly around the handle of his cane. If he heard the insult, he gave no sign. But Red Hoodie wasn't satisfied. Emboldened by the silence, he stepped forward, swaying slightly as the bus rattled over a pothole. "Hey, old man," he called out, louder this time. "What's the cane for? Swatting flies or holding yourself up?" The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting through the uneasy quiet. A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one spoke up. It was the kind of situation that people avoided, an unspoken rule to mind your own business and keep your head down. The old man finally shifted in his seat, turning just enough to glance at the boy. His expression was unreadable, calm, steady, with eyes that seemed to see right through the bravado. For a moment, it was as if time paused, the air inside the bus growing heavier. "You think you're funny, don't you?" the old man said, his voice low but firm. Red Hoodie faltered just for a second, but quickly recovered. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" "Got something to say," he taunted, stepping closer. The bus jostled again, its motion underscoring the growing tension. The other passengers were silent now, their attention locked on the unfolding scene. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, as if waiting to see how it would all play out. The elderly man leaned back slightly, his hand resting on the cane. "Son," he began, his tone measured, "there's a difference between strength and noise. You're making a lot of noise." Red Hoodie's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His friends, too, seemed less sure of themselves, their laughter tapering off into awkward chuckles. "What are you? Some kind of preacher?" one of them muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The old man's gaze didn't waver. "No," he replied. "Just someone who's lived long enough to know that lessons don't always come easy. Sometimes they have to be earned." For a moment, the bus was eerily quiet, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the faint creak of the cane beneath the man's hand. Red Hoodie shifted uncomfortably, his bravado dimming under the weight of the man's words. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially in youth, and he wasn't ready to back down. "Yeah, well, maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson," he said, his voice laced with false confidence. The old man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the boy's words. "Be careful what you ask for," he said, his tone almost a warning. The bus hit a red light, lurching to a halt. The tension was palpable now, a quiet storm brewing in the confined space. Passengers sat frozen, unsure of whether to intervene or stay out of it. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed, but his hands steady on the wheel. Red Hoodie's friends exchanged nervous looks, sensing that the situation was spiraling into unfamiliar territory. "Come on, man, let's just chill," one of them mumbled, but the boy in the hoodie shook his head, unwilling to lose face. The elderly man's expression didn't change. He stayed seated, his cane steady in his grip, his presence somehow growing larger despite his stillness. And as the bus shuddered back into motion, the old man's calm gaze met Red Hoodie's one last time. "Some lessons," he said quietly, "are taught the hard way." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, as the bus rattled onward. The passengers held their breath, sensing that something was about to happen, something they would not soon forget. The bus moved steadily through the evening streets, its passengers glued to the unfolding drama, even as some tried to feign disinterest. Red Hoodie stood there, still staring down the old man, but his posture betrayed him. His shoulders were stiff, and his fingers twitched nervously. There was a crack in his confidence now, as though the man's calm demeanor had thrown him off balance. The elderly man remained seated, his cane still resting across his lap. He wasn't trying to provoke anything. His tone, his posture, everything about him suggested restraint. But there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a story no one in that bus could yet fathom. "Tell me something, kid," the old man said, his voice steady but low enough to make the boy lean in slightly to hear. "What's got you so angry at the world?" The question wasn't mocking. It wasn't condescending. It was calm, direct, and it landed with more weight than Red Hoodie expected. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. His bravado flared up again, almost instinctively. "I'm not angry," he snapped, louder than necessary. "What are you, my therapist?" The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, son, I'm not. But I've seen enough young men like you to know there's always something underneath the noise. You're not as tough as you think you are." Red Hoodie clenched his jaw, his pride stinging. His friends, still hanging back, exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to their leader taking charge, always the loudest, the boldest in the group. But tonight, something felt off. The old man wasn't reacting the way anyone expected, and it unsettled them. The bus stopped again, a hiss of air brakes filling the tense silence. A few passengers got off, moving quickly as though relieved to escape the brewing confrontation. The remaining ones stayed, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. The driver's eyes darted back and forth between the road and his mirror, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. Red Hoodie crossed his arms, trying to regain control of the moment. "You don't know anything about me, old man," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. The elderly man gave a small nod. "You're right. I don't. But I know people. And I know pain when I see it." The boy faltered again, his bravado sipping for just a second. He glanced at his friends as if looking for support, but none of them spoke. The old man leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting out the window. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "I wasn't much older than you when I first got sent halfway across the world. Vietnam. Ever heard of it?" The boy hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I've heard of it," he muttered, though his tone made it clear he didn't know much beyond the name. The old man nodded again, his expression distant, as if he were looking at something only he could see. "Back then, I was just like you. Full of fire, thinking I had the world figured out. Thought I was invincible. Then life taught me otherwise." The air inside the bus seemed to grow heavier with those words. Even the passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now fully invested, their eyes fixed on the old man. "I was just a kid when I got drafted," he continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Didn't even know where Vietnam's on a map. But suddenly, I was there, surrounded by jungle, heat, and a kind of fear you can't explain unless you've lived through it. Every day was a fight to survive. Every night, you wondered if you'd see the morning." The boy's friends shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the story they had expected. Even Red Hoodie seemed caught off guard, his bravado fading into something closer to curiosity. You know what kind of land out there? The old man asked, his gaze now locking onto the boy. That real strength isn't about how loud you can be. It's not about who you can intimidate or how tough you look. Real strength is quiet. It's steady, and it comes from knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away. The bus hit another stoplight, the sudden stillness making his words hung in the air even longer. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Red Hoodie seemed at a loss, his cocky demeanor melting into something more vulnerable. You don't know me, the boy said again, but this time his voice lacked the sharp edge it had before. The old man tilted his head, studying the boy carefully. Maybe not, but I know you're better than this. I can see it in you, even if you can't see it yet. Red Hoodie looked away, his jaw tightening. His friends stayed quiet, their usual laughter and banter replaced by an awkward silence. The other passengers watched with bated breath, unsure of where this conversation was heading but unable to look away. The bus rumbled back into motion, the city lights flickering past the windows. The tension lingered thick and unresolved, as if the air itself was waiting for something to break the spell. For the first time, Red Hoodie seemed unsure of himself. His confidence, his need to impress his friends, it all seemed to waver under the weight of the old man's words. But pride is a stubborn thing, and even as doubt crept into his expression, he couldn't quite let go of the need to save face. You think you're so wise, huh? He muttered, though his voice lacked the conviction it had before. Just 'cause you've been through some stuff doesn't mean you know everything. The old man smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. No, son, he said quietly. I don't know everything, but I know enough to tell you this. The choices you make now will shape the man you become. And someday you'll look back and wish you'd made better ones. The boy didn't respond. He stared at the old man for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The bus continued its steady journey, the hum of the engine filling the silence that followed. The other passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the boy and the old man. The tension wasn't gone, but it had changed, softening into something more reflective, more uncertain. And as the bus rolled on through the city streets, the story seemed to linger in the air, unfinished, waiting for its next chapter to unfold. The bus turned onto a dimly lit street, its headlights carving paths through the evening haze. The old man's story had left an uneasy quiet hanging in the air. Even the hum of the bus engine seemed subdued, as though the vehicle itself could sense the weight of the conversation. Red Hoodie sat back against a pole, his arms crossed over his chest, but his eyes gave him away. He wasn't as dismissive as he tried to appear. For all his posturing, the old man's words had stuck. They hovered like a shadow over his thoughts, a quiet nagging he couldn't shake. It wasn't just what the man said. It was how he said it. The calm, the certainty, the absolute lack of fear. Red Hoodie had spent his life perfecting the art of being intimidating, but this man didn't even flinch. It was unnerving, almost alien. Behind him, one of his friends nudged the other and muttered something under his breath, a half-hearted attempt to rekindle their usual bravado. It didn't land. The group felt fractured, unsure of how to respond to this unexpected turn. The dynamic had shifted, and none of them could figure out how to regain control. The old man adjusted his grip on the cane, his hand tightening briefly before relaxing again. He glanced toward the driver, who was watching the scene unfold through the rearview mirror, and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. The driver looked away, his knuckles still white on the steering wheel. I get it, the old man said after a long pause, his voice breaking the silence. You think the world owes you something, and maybe it does. Life hasn't been fair to you. But let me tell you a hard truth. It's not about what the world owes you. It's about what you decide to do with the hand you've been dealt. The boy shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched tightly. He hated how those words hit too close to home, how they poked at wounds he didn't want anyone to see. You don't know my life, Red Hoodie said finally, his voice quieter now. No, I don't, the old man admitted, leaning forward slightly. But I've lived long enough to know that everyone carries their own battles. And sometimes the loudest ones are just trying to drown out their own pain. The bus lurched slightly as it hit a pothole, jolting everyone in their seats. A woman near the front muttered something under her breath, clutching her purse a little tighter. The tension was palpable, thick like the air before a storm. "You think I'm scared of you, don't you?" the old man asked suddenly, his tone challenging, but not aggressive. Red Hoodie blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure how to answer, and his silence spoke volumes. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. "I face things that would make your little stunts here look like child's play. You can puff out your chest, make all the noise you want. It doesn't scare me. But let me tell you something, kid. One day, you're going to run into someone who doesn't stop to talk. Someone who doesn't care why you're angry or what you're trying to prove. And when that day comes, all this tough guy act isn't going to save you." The boy's friends exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the man's words pressing down on them too. They'd all heard stories, rumors about fights gone wrong, about kids getting caught up in situations they couldn't handle. But hearing it from someone who spoke with such authority, such lived experience, made it feel real in a way they weren't prepared for. "Why do you care, huh?" Red Hoodie snapped, though his voice cracked slightly. "Why do you even bother talking to me?" The old man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more sadness than joy. "Because someone once bothered to talk to me when I was your age, and it made all the difference." For a moment, the boy didn't know what to say. His mind was a mess of emotions, anger, confusion, shame, but beneath it all, there was something else, something that felt like the tiniest flicker of hope. The bus slowed as it approached another stop, the hiss of the brakes breaking the silence. A couple of passengers got off, their eyes lingering on the scene as they walked away. The old man leaned back in his seat, his gaze shifting to the window. But the boy wasn't ready to let it go. Something about the man's words gnawed at him, pulling at threads he didn't even realize were loose. "What happened to you?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. The old man didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing his words, deciding how much to share. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost wistful. "Too much to tell in one bus ride," he said simply, "but enough to know that life's too short to waste it trying to prove something to people who don't matter." The boy frowned, his mind racing. He didn't want to admit it, but the man's words made sense. More sense than anything anyone had said to him in a long time. The bus continued its journey, the city lights casting flickering shadows across the passengers' faces. The tension hadn't completely dissipated, but something had shifted. There was no resolution, no grand moment of understanding. Just the quiet, unspoken realization that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than this. The bus seemed to glide through the city like a vessel on uneasy waters, the mood inside a mix of quiet tension and unspoken questions. Red Hoodie sat still now, his gaze fixed on the old man. His usual defiance was gone, replaced by something deeper, an emotion he wasn't used to confronting. His friends had fallen silent too, their earlier bravado evaporated. It was as if the old man had cracked open something none of them were prepared to face. Outside, the streets grew darker, the city's hum settling into the quieter rhythm of night. Neon signs flickered on corners, their light catching on the rain-slick pavement. The old man rested his hand on his cane, his fingers drumming softly against the polished wood. His eyes were distant, as though lost in memories too heavy to share. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the low rumble of the engine and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. The tension felt like it could snap at any moment. The old man's calm presence kept it from spiraling out of control. "Why didn't you tell us then?" Red Hoodie said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "You keep talking like you've seen it all. What makes you so different?" The old man turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting the boy's. His eyes were tired but piercing, as if they could see straight through him. "You want to know what makes me different," he said quietly. "It's not the medals or the battles. It's not even the things I've survived. It's the choices I've made after all of it. That's what separates people, the choices they make when it matters most." The boy scoffed, though it lacked conviction. What's that supposed to mean? It means, the old man said, leaning forward slightly, that every moment in your life, you're writing your story. And one day, you'll look back and realize how those moments defined who you are. The question is, what kind of story do you want it to be? The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Red Hoodie shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering again. He glanced at his friends, but they offered no support. They were as lost in their own thoughts as he was, each of them grappling with the weight of the man's words. As the bus turned onto a quieter street, the atmosphere seemed to grow even more intense. The old man's calm demeanor only heightened the unease. There was something about him, something unshakable. He wasn't just another passenger. He carried an air of quiet authority, the kind that came from a life lived on the edge of danger. "You think you've got it all figured out?" the boy muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "But you don't know what it's like for us. You don't know what we've been through." The old man's expression softened, but his eyes didn't waver. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't know your story. But I know what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like the world's against you. I've been there, and I've learned that it's not about where you've been. It's about where you choose to go." The bus slowed to a stop, a hiss of the brakes cutting through the heavy silence. A few passengers got off, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. The old man watched them for a moment before turning back to the boy. "You've got a choice to make," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You can keep going down this road, trying to prove how tough you are. Or you can decide to be better. Stronger, not for anyone else, for yourself." Red Hoodie didn't respond, but his expression betrayed his inner turmoil. For the first time in a long time he felt seen, truly seen, and it scared him. The bus resumed its journey, a cityscape giving way to quieter, more desolate streets. The old man's words lingered, echoing the boy's mind. He wanted to dismiss them, to brush them off as the ramblings of an old man who didn't understand. But he couldn't. They stuck like a seed planted deep in the soil of his thoughts. As the bus rounded a corner, the old man shifted in his seat, his movements deliberate. His cane tapped softly against the floor, a rhythm that seemed almost purposeful. There was a sense of finality in his demeanor, as though he knew something no one else did. The boy's friends exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence eroded completely. They were caught in the same web of tension, unsure of how to move forward. The old man had turned their world upside down with just a few words, and they didn't know how to regain their footing. Outside, the streets grew darker, the city's lights casting long to distorted shadows. The bus felt like a cocoon, a space suspended between past and future, between choices made and paths yet to be taken. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the old man raised a hand, silencing him. "Not every battle is fought with fists," he said, his voice low but firm. "Sometimes the hardest fight is the one inside yourself." The words struck a chord, resonating in a way the boy couldn't explain. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight. But he didn't look away. For the first time, he felt like someone was speaking to him, not at him. The bus began to slow again, its headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. The old man leaned back, his gaze steady but distant. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The tension had reached its peak, every word and every glance building towards something inevitable. The boy didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it. A moment of truth, a choice that would define everything. And as the bus came to a stop, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. As the bus hissed to a stop, the air inside seemed to thicken, charged with an almost tangible sense of anticipation. Red Hoodie's eyes flicked toward the front, where the driver was glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. Something was off. The old man's gaze, sharp as ever, darted to the same mirror before settling back on the boy. "You feel that?" The old man murmured, his tone quieter now, but carrying the weight of a warning. Red Hoodie frowned, his bravado momentarily overtaken by confusion. "Feel what?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he shifted in his seat, his hand gripping the cane with renewed purpose. The subtle movement didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers, who seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. A few of them exchanged wary glances, the unease spreading like ripples in water. The doors at the front of the bus swung open, and two figures stepped inside. They were dressed casually enough to blend into the city's late-night backdrop. But there was something about their movements, too deliberate, too purposeful, that set them apart. Their eyes swept over the passengers like predators scanning a herd. Red Hoodie tensed instinctively, his earlier bravado evaporating. His friends shrank back into their seats, their earlier confidence replaced by wide-eyed silence. The old man, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. The taller of the two newcomers spoke first, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "All right, folks, let's keep this simple. Nobody needs to get hurt. Just hand over your valuables, and we'll be on our way." A collective gasp rippled through the bus. Passengers clutched their bags and phones, their fear palpable. The second man, stockier and more aggressive, began moving down the aisle, his gaze hard and unrelenting. Red Hoodie froze, his mind racing. This wasn't how he'd expected the night to go. He glanced at the old man, who was watching the scene unfold with an unnerving calm. The stocky man stopped in front of Red Hoodie and his friends, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you've got something worth taking," he sneered, extending a hand. Red Hoodie swallowed hard, his fists clenching at his sides. He could feel his friend's eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. But before he could react, the old man spoke. "Leave him be," he said, his voice steady and calm, but carrying a weight that made the stocky man pause. The man turned to the old man, a smirk playing at his lips. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Some kind of hero." The old man's expression didn't waver. "Just a guy trying to get home." "Same as you." The tension in the air was electric now, every passenger holding their breath. The taller man, sensing the shift, stepped closer. "Listen, old-timer, we don't have time for this. Stay out of it." But the old man didn't back down. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his grip tightening on his cane. "Funny thing about time," he said, his voice low but deliberate. "You never know how much you've got left." The stocky man laughed, but it was forced, uneasy. "You've got a death wish or something." The old man's eyes sharpened, and for a brief moment, something flickered there, something cold and unyielding. "Not mine," he said softly. Before anyone could process his words, the taller man reached for a woman's purse, yanking it away with a rough tug. The woman cried out, and the bus erupted into chaos. Passengers scrambled to move away, their fear turning the confined space into a swirl of panic. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The old man moved. It wasn't a dramatic leap or a flashy maneuver. It was precise, calculated. His cane struck the taller man's wrist with a sharp crack, sending the stolen purse clattering to the floor. The man howled in pain, clutching his arm as he stumbled back. The stocky man lunged toward the old man, but he was ready. The cane came up again, this time hooking behind the man's knee and yanking it out from under him. He hit the floor hard, the air knocked out of him. The bus erupted into stunned silence, every eye on the old man. His movements had been so fast, so efficient, that it took a moment for everyone to process what had just happened. Red Hoodie stared, his mouth slightly open. The old man wasn't just some grizzled veteran with stories to tell. He was something else entirely, something dangerous. The taller man staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You're going to regret that, old man," he snarled, reaching into his jacket. But the old man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze steady. "I face worse than you," he said quietly. The stocky man groaned, struggling to get up. But before he could, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The faint red and blue lights flickering outside the bus sent the would-be robbers into a panic. The taller man grabbed his partner by the arm, driving him toward the front of the bus. "Let's get out of here," he barked. They bolted through the open doors just as the police cars screeched to a halt outside. The passengers erupted into relieved murmurs, some of them clapping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. But Red Hoodie wasn't looking at the retreating figures or the flashing lights. His eyes were fixed on the old man, who had quietly returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man didn't answer right away. He simply leaned back, his gaze distant once more. "Just someone who's made a lot of choices," he said finally. "And tonight so did you." The boy frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The old man turned to him, his eyes softening. "You had a choice to make back there. To step up or to step aside. You didn't choose either, but you're starting to see that you can. That's the first step." The boy didn't respond, his mind swirling with questions. But one thing was clear. This night and this man had changed everything. And as the bus began to move again, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that his story was just beginning. As the bus rolled forward, the tension inside began to ebb, though a certain weight lingered in the air. People whispered among themselves, sharing fragments of disbelief and gratitude for their unexpected protector. Red Hoodie sat frozen, his thoughts tangled. The old man had just dismantled 2 armed thieves with a cane and an air of calm that spoke volumes. Outside, the sirens faded as the police pursued the fleeing robbers. The bus driver called out nervously, asking if everyone was okay, but his voice barely registered. All eyes remained fixed on the old man, who sat quietly, his cane resting across his lap. But just as the bus reached the next stop, a voice broke the spell. It was the woman whose purse had been stolen and returned. "Sir," she said softly, stepping toward the old man. "Thank you. You saved us tonight." The old man looked up, his face softening into a gentle smile. "Just glad no one got hurt," he replied simply. But Red Hoodie couldn't let it go. "That wasn't just luck," he blurted out, drawing everyone's attention. "You knew what you were doing. You're not just some regular guy." The old man sighed, the weight of his years seeming to settle on him again. "Kid," he began, his tone patient, "life teaches you things if you live long enough. That's all." But Red Hoodie wasn't buying it. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're more than that. You've seen stuff, done stuff. I can tell." For a moment, the old man didn't respond. His eyes, distant and wary, seemed to peer into a past only he could see. Then, with a reluctant nod, he leaned back and spoke, his voice low enough that only the boy could hear. "I wasn't always this old," he said, a faint trace of humor in his tone. "A long time ago, I was in a place far from here, Vietnam. I did things there I'm not proud of, things I thought I'd left behind. But some lessons stick with you, whether you like it or not." The boy's eyes widened. He'd heard stories about Vietnam from movies and school, but hearing it from someone who had been there was different. "So, all that back there," he said, gesturing toward the front of the bus, "that's from the war?" The old man's expression darkened. "War teaches you how to survive, but surviving and living, they're not the same thing." Before Red Hoodie could respond, the bus jerked to a stop again, this time more abruptly. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom, filled with panic. "Everybody stay on the bus. The police are outside." Sure enough, flashing lights illuminated the windows as officers surrounded the vehicle. A sharp knock came at the doors, and the driver reluctantly opened them. 2 officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the passengers. "We're looking for a suspect," one of them announced. "Reports say he's armed and dangerous. We need everyone to remain calm." Red Hoodie's heart sank. He glanced at the old man, who had gone completely still. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a sharp, almost predatory focus. One officer moved down the aisle, asking each passenger if they had seen anything unusual. When he reached the old man, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition. The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his belt. "You," the officer said, his tone worry. "Stand up." The old man didn't move. "I didn't do anything," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. The officer's partner stepped closer, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Sir, we need you to cooperate." Red Hoodie jumped to his feet. "He didn't do anything. he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. He stopped the guys who tried to rob us. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicion momentarily giving way to confusion. The passengers chimed in, voices overlapping as they corroborated the boy's story. He saved us. They ran because of him. That man's a hero. The officers hesitated, clearly unprepared for the outpouring of support. The first officer turned back to the old man, his expression softening. Is this true? The old man nodded slowly, just did what anyone would have done. The officers relaxed, their hands dropping to their sides. We'll lead a statement, one of them said, though his tone was no longer accusatory. But it sounds like we owe you a thank you. As the tension dissolved, Red Hoodie felt a surge of relief, but the old man's expression remained guarded, his eyes scanning the windows as if expecting trouble. Just as the officers turned to leave, a commotion erupted outside. The sound of tires screeching and voices shouting filled the air. The taller robber was back, his face twisted with desperation as he held a makeshift weapon. A broken bottle. Get back, he screamed, his eyes wild as he lunged toward one of the officers. Everything happened in a blur. The old man was on his feet before anyone else could react. He moved faster than seemed possible for someone his age, slipping past the officer and intercepting the robber. The bottle swung wildly, but the old man sidestepped with ease. In one swift motion, his cane came up, disarming the robber and sending the bottle clattering to the ground. The man stumbled, only to find himself pinned by a firm grip on his shoulder. The officers recovered quickly, rushing to cuff the subdued robber. The scene ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the passengers and police alike in stunned silence. As the officers hauled the robber away, one of them turned to the old man, his expression one of genuine respect. I don't know who you are, he said, but you've done more tonight than we could have asked for. Thank you. The old man nodded, his face unreadable. Just glad I could help. As the bus finally resumed its journey, Red Hoodie couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's story wasn't over. There was something about him, something unfinished. You ever think about telling people your story? The boy asked hesitantly. The old man smiled faintly, his gaze distant once more. Sometimes, he said. But stories are funny things. They don't always end where you think they will. And with that, the bus rolled on into the night, leaving behind a story that would linger in the minds of everyone who had been there. A story of courage, redemption, and the quiet strength of a man who had lived through the worst and come out on the other side.